5 minutes after the moving truck left, 3 HOA board members marched onto my private pier and told me to tear it down right then, right now. They had that righteous, clipped way of speaking, like they'd practiced intimidating people in conference rooms not at the water's edge. What they didn't know, and what I could barely keep from smiling about, was that every boat slip they could see, every dock they were standing on, and the entire marina behind them belonged to me. My name is Dash Kensington, and if you told me 6 months earlier I'd trade servers and screens for salt air and a legal war on a pier, I would have laughed until my lungs hurt. Back then I ran a cryptocurrency operation I built from the ground up, servers, contracts, warehouses, and I sold it when I turned 34. I walked away with a nest egg, a thirst for something real, and a determination to stop living inside a glow of monitors. So I bought a modest waterfront cabin thinking I wanted peace wood floors and the honest creak of a dock at night. What I got instead was a front row seat to the weirdest little war for territory I've ever seen. The house was simple, but the listing had a tiny legal footnote about maritime agreements and riparian rights. Most people skip that stuff, I don't. I'd spent years parsing dense contracts, so my brain perked up the moment I read it. I met the seller, an elderly woman named Mrs. Peaton, who kept apologizing for not understanding her late husband's business. She handed me a massive ring of boat keys, 30, maybe 40, and shrugged. These might be important. I tucked them in my pocket, thinking they were sentimental clutter. I did not realize at the time they were the keys to someone's life's work. On moving day, the sky was the bright, clean sort of morning that makes everything seem possible. The movers left, I stood on the pier, breathed the salt in deep, and felt something in me settle. Then they came, 3 people, stride synchronized purpose on their faces. The leader was Serafina Westmont, president of the local homeowners association, a woman who dressed like she belonged on a yacht club board, but moved like she wanted to run the harbor. She stepped onto my pier without asking, announced herself, and told me very sweetly that my setup violated community maritime standards. "You have 72 hours," she said, "to dismantle that pier and remove all fishing equipment." I told them this was my property. I had closed 3 weeks earlier. I'd specifically avoided HOA entanglements when I bought the place. I said I had no intention of running a commercial fishing business. It was for me, for crabbing on weekends, maybe taking a friend out for sunset. Serafina didn't blink. She spoke with that polished condescension people use when they believe legal boxes will bend in their favor. "Even recreational activities that disrupt community standards are violations," she said, and the 2 other board members behind her nodded like they'd rehearsed the line. One of them clicked photos with the intensity of someone building a case file. I left that day with an ultimatum in my pocket and one thought spinning in my head. Why would the HOA escalate this so fast? I'd spent the following days talking to captains and dockhands, trying to understand who actually used the harbor and how. Everywhere I went, people greeted me like I'd always belonged or like they'd been waiting for me. "You're the new owner of the Piton place," one charter captain said with that mix of curiosity and relief. "Harold ran a pretty serious operation out of there. Harold who?" The name sounded familiar to a lot of folks, and that made me uncomfortable. I called my brother Caspian. Maritime law in Seattle is his thing, and he laughed before he could help it. "Dash, stop and get a title search," he said. "Waterfront is notoriously complicated. You might have bought more than a cabin." I called Victoria Sterling, a maritime attorney Caspian recommended, and she told me to sit down. Her voice had that steady legal calm that you either love or fear. She started asking questions the seller never had about licenses, slip agreements, fuel concessions. My chest went cold. Had I paid $900,000 for a house or for a business? Victoria dug. She pulled documents, surveyed plans, maps with ink that traced boundaries I'd never seen. The truth landed like a wave. I had acquired the controlling interest in a long-running marina operation. Harold Peaton, it turned out, he hadn't been a hobbyist. He'd been a businessman who ran slips, fuel services, charter partnerships, even training arrangements with the Coast Guard. The little ring of keys wasn't sentimental junk. They unlocked a living, breathing maritime enterprise that had quietly supported the harbor community for 35 years. That explained everything. Serafina's sudden fury, the captain's nods, the way the harbor seemed to hum with decades of activity. It explained why her threats weren't just rhetoric, but could actually ripple through people's livelihoods. And it explained why when she stormed my pier, She was unknowingly threatening her own neighbors by trying to shut down what turned out to be their economic lifeline. Victoria also uncovered a lease the marina held with the residential developers, a 99-year agreement underwriting waterfront access. The neat little irony was ugly. The HOA members had been paying fees for their harbor access fees that funneled to the very business Serafina wanted to destroy. When we put that on paper, the room tilted. I'll never forget Serafina's face when Victoria unrolled the survey map at the HOA meeting and her world went quiet. It was the sound of authority evaporating. We could have gone scorched earth. I had the financial wherewithal, and Victoria had the legal groundwork to make Serafina's interference look like a personal liability. Instead, I decided to do something I hadn't expected to do. I took the high road, but I did it with teeth. At the emergency HOA meeting, I didn't try to humiliate her. I showed the community what their harbor actually was, who it served, and the damage her actions had caused. We brought captains, fuel depot managers, and a Coast Guard training official as witnesses. We documented canceled contracts, postponed exercises, lost revenue. The damages added up fast. When the math hit the room, support flipped. People who had nodded along with Serafina's grievances suddenly realized they were standing against their own interests. The fallout was swift. A settlement for the documented damages, an agreement to restructure homeowner communications, and Serafina stepping down from the board. The woman who'd tried to make me tear down my pier walked away with less than she'd bargained for, and the community, shaken awake, asked how to prevent this from happening again. I didn't gloat, not in front of the families whose paychecks and training schedules were affected, but I did make sure the marina's recovery was prioritized. In the weeks after, I discovered more of Harold's plans tucked in file cabinets above the office, scribbled notes about expansion deals with yacht service companies, partnerships he never had the time to finish. I found contracts with cooperatives across state lines, environmental agreements, even tentative proposals for a Coast Guard service extension. It was like opening a time capsule that said quietly, this marina was meant to grow. With experienced partners, a former Coast Guard officer turned consultant, a marine biologist from the neighborhood, and David Peaton, Harold's nephew, who showed up with decades of practical knowledge, we built a plan that balanced economic growth with stewardship. We added solar panels, better filtration systems, a marine education center for kids, and a neighborhood advisory board, so residents could actually have a voice in operations. The irony is delicious. The woman who tried to bully me out of the place ended up accelerating the very improvements she claimed to care about. Her panic battered the community into re-examining the relationship they'd had with the harbor, and once they saw the numbers and the human faces behind them, they rallied. The marina grew responsibly. We increased capacity, launched youth programs that connected local schools with maritime careers, and kept environmental safeguards at the core of every decision. People who once feared commercial activity now showed up for fishing lessons and summer boat rides with their kids. If there's a moral here, and I promise I don't like preaching, it's this: power without understanding is dangerous, and assumptions about what belongs to whom can lead to real damage. Serafina tried to assert control over something she didn't comprehend, and in that gap she hurt neighbors and local businesses. My accidental inheritance taught me that stewardship beats domination. It taught me that the best revenge against someone trying to make you small is to build something bigger, something that anchors people and creates value. More than money, owning that marina gave me a role in a community. It tied me to people who work with their hands and measure success by how many kids learn to fish, not by a quarterly report. A few months later, as families crowded the docks for a community appreciation day with laughter and the muffled thrum of boat engines and the smell of fried fish in the air, I stood on the pier and felt oddly proud. Harold's legacy, messy, complicated, and quietly generous, had survived. The keys in my pocket opened doors to a life I hadn't planned for, and that surprised me in the best possible way. So here's my question for you: when someone in your neighborhood tries to wield power without understanding the full picture, should they be held personally accountable for the fallout or cut some slack because they meant well? Tell me what you think. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of HOA, overreach, or neighborhood drama, share your story and where you're watching from. I want to hear it.